This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
Like most researchers and curators at the ANS, Peter is not a numismatist by initial training. He is a classical philologist, and he specialized in ancient shipwreck excavation in Turkey and in the Red Sea. So after developing his research, he met the light and joined the ANS in 2002 to oversee the Greek cabinet. So at the ANS, he has multiple roles. And first of all, he's now our chief curator and oversees the entire curatorial department. But at the same time, he's an editor of the American Journal of Numismatics. He edits the ANS magazine and runs the Eric P. Newman graduate summer seminar that will happen this year again after a hiatus of 2 years because of the pandemic. So he has curated a number of exhibits and as well has been responsible for the development of the NEH-funded online resource Hellenistic Royal Coinages HRC. In 2020, he's received another NEH grant with colleagues at Oxford University in order to focus on Indo-Greek and Bactrian coinages. Dr. Van Alfen, Peter, has received fellowship from the Institute for Advanced Study, the Le Classical Library Foundation, and the National Endowment for Humanities. In 2017-18, he was president of the New York Numismatic Club, and in 2019 was awarded the Burnett Anderson Memorial Award for Excellence in Numismatic Writing. He's currently a member of the Citizens Coinage Advisory Committee. Peter?
Thank you, Gilles. Very much appreciated. You know, in fact, just recounting my earlier training, the fact that I was not a numismatist when I first came to the ANS, I have to say that after 20 years here at the ANS, I'm only now starting to feel like I am slowly becoming a numismatist. There is so much to learn, and it has really taken me so long to try to get a grasp on it. So this talk tonight, called Payment, Profit, or Prestige, is a talk that I've been working on for a while now, and I'm hoping that this will appear in print sometime in the near future. So those of you who would like to follow up on this, if you have any questions, certainly do write me. I do have a version of this that I would be happy to share with you, which is a little bit more formal and hopefully will be printed. So as one of the most abundant types of artifacts from the ancient world, coinage is a testament to the mass production of monetary instruments undertaken by hundreds, if not thousands, of political authorities scattered across the Mediterranean region and beyond. For every series of coins produced, some authoritative figure or council made rational decisions about most every aspect of the coins, including the critical decision of whether or not to strike coins in the first place. Despite the abundant physical testament to these decisions, there is an absolute dearth of written testament of these rationalities. And even so, attempting to explain why it is that a particular political authority made the decision to strike coins at a particular time is a task that numismatists, particularly those who work on ancient coins, rarely shy away from. Lacking, as we generally do, clear statements from authorities in the distant past, our answers are necessarily speculative. Ian Caritas, in fact, had this to say on the matter in his 1987 study of Persian royal coinage, quote, "It might be wiser to resist entirely the temptation to speculate on the occasion of issue," unquote. Even so, he himself could not resist that temptation, and rarely do the rest of us, since frankly, where's the fun in that? Let's see if I can switch the slide now. Try this. Oh, go back one. All right. When we do have a go at it, our methodologies are pretty straightforward. We work up our conclusions by gathering the evidence at our disposal, not just the raw numismatic data, but also the available textual, epigraphic, and archaeological evidence that might provide specific historical or other contextualizations. We then assemble all this evidence within a theoretical framework that presupposes a relationship between coinage and the larger concept of money, coinage and economic structures, and coinage and the state. For our purposes here, I'll call this framework the political economy of coin production. And my current concern in this paper tonight is primarily with this framework and to what extent it might need to be adjusted, especially with respect to Achaemenid coinage. I adopt the term political economy here purposefully. Since its first use in the 18th century, the term has remained astoundingly vague, meaning different things to different people at different times. The term first came to light as the name of a developing science on how best to arrange the revenues and expenditures of states to generate greater wealth. In due course, those engaged in these studies dropped the political portion entirely, preferring to call it just straight economics as the title of their field. At the same time, they began to develop the key characteristics of Homo economicus, the ideal economic actor, whose fierce self-interest drives an incessant balancing of costs and benefits to decide on a course of action that maximizes individual utility or personal advantage. And typically, when we talk about rationality within the sphere of economics, we mean this logic of maximizing utilities, urging individuals or corporate bodies to make so-called rational choices to that end. To better understand this decision process, rational choice theory itself has attracted a great deal of scholarship across the social sciences, which thankfully we don't have time to get in here tonight. I will note, however, that while a lot of this scholarship has pointed out the limitations of the theory for describing so-called real-world behavior, nonetheless, it remains a key component for a lot of work in economics and, more recently, for political science as well. For political scientists, the term political economy has a different meaning, which obviously focuses more on the political side of things. Their interest has been in applying the methodologies of Homo economicus and rational choice theory to the analysis of political and social action rather than just economic action. Thus, in this context, the personal advantage that individuals seek with their choices and actions are not necessarily economic, like acquiring more money, but could be something else, like ensuring political survival. For my purposes here, then, the term political economy incorporates at its core a mode of rationality, that is, maximizing utility, for decision-making in both the economic and political spheres. The term also offers, when considering its long history and shifting meanings, an umbrella under which a spectrum of decision-making about coin production can be placed, that ranges from those decisions that are more purely economic to those that are more political, along with various politico-economic shades in between. Why this is important, I'll get to in a bit, but first I'd like to take a look more closely at our current theoretical framework for why it is we think ancient authorities struck coins. Within the field of numismatics, particularly ancient Greek numismatics, our current political economy framework does not really address the mode of rationality that lies at its core, but rather offers for consideration a menu of reasons that ancient authorities might have had for striking coins. This framework, as is, includes several key assumptions. One, that ancient coins were always money. Two, that their primary, if not sole function, was to facilitate economic transactions, whether private or public. And three, that coins were issued by states that were continuously seeking to maximize revenues and reduce expenditures. Most of these assumptions, which have been derived from the field of economics, seem so obvious as to not warrant comment. Yet not all scholars, especially those working outside of our field, always fully agree with them. And this is something that I'll return to in a moment. So based on these assumptions, our conclusions tend to favor economically motivated reasons for striking coins over any that are more purely political or otherwise non-economically motivated. There are three readily identifiable groupings that these economically motivated reasons tend to fall into. One is one that focuses on decisions to provide coins for markets, both domestic and international. Two, one that focuses on decisions to derive many revenues from coin production. And three, one that focuses on decisions to meet public debts or expenditures with the production of coins. And some of these often seem more probable than others. Reasons to provide coins for local markets or international trading purposes, for example, receive little direct support in ancient texts and are rather hard to prove from numismatic data alone. As Colin Cray demonstrated in his seminal 1964 article, Hoards, Small Change, and the Origin of Coinage. More recent attempts, such as my own, to identify a specific role for coinage in late archaic long-distance trade with Egypt and the Aegean, and thus a reason for the production of coinage, have been frankly equivocal. On a more positive note, Henry Kim has argued in a frequently cited paper from 20 years ago that many archaic and later authorities endeavored to provide small change specifically for local transactional needs. Reasons that focus on the link between coin production and state fiscal concerns find a great deal more support in ancient sources, including the pseudo-Aristotelian Economikos, which gives several examples of ways in which Greek authorities from the archaic period onward issued coins to generate revenue and to meet their expenses, which often far outstripped the resources they had at hand. Other texts, like the famed 2nd century BC Sestos decree, also make it clear that generating revenue from the production of coinage through overvaluation or some kind of fee might be topmost in the minds of the authorities making the decisions. Supported by these sources, a great many of the reasons we offer for ancient coin production tends to favor revenue or expenditure, particularly expenditures related to military activity. And this has held true even in the face of criticism. When Chris Haugigo published his now classic article, Why Did Ancient States Strike Coins, in 1990, his intent was to push back hard against Michael Crawford's insistence that state payments were the primary reason for coin production, and so provided pages of alternative reasons. Of course, in his conclusions, Haugigo had to admit that payments were probably an important reason, but one that needed to be balanced with others, some of which had little to do with revenues or expenditures. This admission, however, was not enough for François de Calatai, who in turn pushed back against Haugigo, marshaling modern analogies, a statistical analysis of the Oikonomikos, and pertinent numismatic data to argue that while Crawford might have gone a little too far in his assessment, he was, in fact, not too far off the mark. Since this chapter appeared 2 decades ago, de Calatai has continued to argue for military expenditure as the prime reason for coin production in the Greek world, attracting a host of supporters. This view has, in the meantime, helped to bury reasons for coin production that seem overly political or non-economic, for which there is little room in our current framework. While in general, numismatists certainly do recognize that there are non-economic aspects to coinage, especially symbolism on the obverse and reverse types, these must play a decidedly secondary role to the primary economic transactional function of coinage. Attempts to eclipse the economic aspect of coinage with the symbolic or political, particularly as reasons for coin production, tend not to be well received by numismatists, as, for example, has been the case with Moses Finley's proclamation that Greek coinage was essentially, quote, a political phenomenon, unquote, an argument built upon John Maynard Keynes' idea of coinage being nothing more than, quote, a piece of local vanity, patriotism, or advertisement, unquote. Curiously, however, we are still open to what Thomas Martin has called the politics as pride thesis, the idea that a decision to produce coins, as the famed Sestos Decree also indicates, could include an authority's desire to assert its identity, autonomy, or prestige to a local or regional international audience. A desire that clearly has little to do with economics and more with political relationships. In fact, the rather vague but politically suggestive word prestige continues to be frequently cited as a reason for ancient coin production, albeit usually in conjunction with other reasons like military payments. To a certain extent, this vagueness betrays a hesitation about what to do with the political more broadly in our conclusions about the reasons for coin production. As comfortable as we might be with reasons that seem more purely economic, like revenues and expenditures, it does not take much to realize that the deeper rationale behind military expenditure, for example, has much less to do with economics than it does with international relations or political survival. Here, then, we begin to see where our current political economic framework needs adjustment, which becomes still more apparent when we consider problems with Achaemenid coinage. So the basic outline of Persian coin production is fairly certain. After the Persian king Cyrus the Great's conquest of Sardis and the Lydian kingdom in the 6th century BC, in the middle of the 6th century, the Persians oversaw the continued production of the gold and silver cresids down to the final quarter of the 6th century, when production of these coins came to a close. Shortly thereafter, around 515 BC, production of the silver siglos began in Sardis, struck to the same weight standard initially as the last of the silver cresids. Some indeterminate time thereafter, production of the gold derricks began in Sardis as well, although these were struck to a different standard than the sigloi, the Babylonian. Both sigloi and derricks were produced in increasingly large numbers towards the middle of the 5th century, which included an upward adjustment in the weight of the siglos to align it better with the value of the derricks, before their production began to taper off towards the end of the century. While siglos production likely ceased by about 400 BC, it is not entirely clear if this was also the case for the derricks. But it was roughly at this juncture that a number of short-lived series appeared, sometimes labeled royal issues, along with the first of the satrapal coinages. After their debut in Northwest Asia Minor, others appeared elsewhere in Western and Southeastern Asia Minor and in Egypt all throughout the 4th century. Most commentators seem to agree that the bulk of these 4th century royal and satrapal coinages were produced for military payments, linked to a number of major conflicts in Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Levant, including eventually Alexander the Great's onslaught. And I am less concerned here with these later issues than I am with the earliest royal issues, the derricks and sigloi. My interest in these two earlier coinages lies in part because of their surprisingly broad range of reasons offered by scholars to explain their existence, not all of which would fit comfortably within our current framework. So let's begin by first looking at those that do. So Raymond Descartes, for example, has offered arguments linking the derricks specifically to a plan to raise revenue through coin production. It was the Lydian kings, he suggests, who first recognized the potential for generating revenue by selling their abundant native precious metals in the form of coinage. Sale of this commodity in coin form continued and was later enhanced by the Persian king Darius, who introduced the exceptionally pure gold daric to generate further demand among those needing a means to store wealth, conduct international trade, or acquire gold for other purposes, such as, for example, the adornment of sanctuaries. The Scots' arguments hinged in part on the production of the Cresids beginning under the Persians, an earlier attribution since disproved by archaeological finds at Sardis. While his arguments obviously now need revision, a portion of it has been echoed more recently by Michel Alram, who has suggested that the darics were conceived and produced primarily to serve as a, quote, super-regional trading currency, unquote. Although there is no mention of the mechanism for releasing these coins to traders, presumably direct sell, which likewise could have generated revenues for the crown. The fact that the introduction of both the sigloi and darics seems to roughly coincide with a string of Persian military operations, first those in Thrace in the 510s BC, then putting down the Ionian revolt in the 490s, and finally Darius's invasion of Greece at the end of the 490s, not to mention maintaining garrisons in Asia Minor, has encouraged others, including Andy Meadows and Christopher Tuplin, to consider payments, particularly military payments, as the reason for these coinages. Although I have doubts that the Persians were paying mercenaries at the beginning of the 5th century, when the sigloi and darics were a recent innovation, nonetheless, there were perhaps expenses related to the care and maintenance of Persian military forces, some of which, particularly in Western Asia Minor, might have been best met with the comparatively low-value sigloi. Later on, the Persians certainly showed themselves willing to bankroll military operations on one side or the other of intra-Greek conflicts, perhaps using royal coinages. We also learned from Xenophon that around 400 BC, a mercenary employed by the Persians was paid 1 daric per month, although it is unclear if daric was the actual specie used in payments or was simply a unit of account. Whether payments might have been made with these coins, they were not, as Ian Caritas has shown in his study of the hordes, taking place beyond Western Asia Minor, where the sigloi at least served, as Alram has put it, local needs. Darics, on the other hand, have been found further afield, but not in significant numbers, a difficult fact to reconcile for a purported trade currency, or indeed for one intended to pay the salaries of ever-mobile mercenaries. The daric, in fact, has long stood out as something of a numismatic curiosity, simultaneously innovative and odd, as detailed recently by Christopher Tuplin. The coin was not, as he notes, part of whatever the original plan was that brought the siglos to light. But even so, along with the sigloi, the darics feature one of the earliest depictions of a human figure on coins. The daric's weight standards ties it directly to the Near Eastern heartland of the empire, where pure gold rarely served as a monetary metal, as was also generally the case in Western Asia Minor. Even the extreme purity of the daric was said by Herodotus to have been deliberately conceived by Darius as a menosinon, a monument. Given these unusual characteristics, it is not surprising that scholars like Peter Vargias have seen the daric serving as primarily a prestige coinage, one meant to further enhance the status of the great king. Some have taken this politicized purpose of the daric still further, however, suggesting that the coinage was conceived not as real currency, but as something somehow different. In his magisterial volume, From Cyrus to Alexander, for example, Pierre Brion had this to say about the daric, quote, "Why create a gold coin whose function was neither to facilitate trade nor to pay soldiers or suppliers? The answer, it is necessary to insist, is the political function of the royal coinage. Darius's initiative was not fundamentally economic in the sense we mean today. It was intended less to pay his expenses than to illustrate his power and expand his prestige. It was at once financial, political, and ideological, unquote. Cindy Numchuk subsequently went one step beyond, arguing that the derricks and sigloi were, as she called them, quote, tokens of royal esteem, unquote, serving as instruments within the system of royal gift giving. She concluded by insisting that the, quote, adoption and adaptation of a coin shape does not necessitate that the item was primarily issued to fill an economic role, unquote. Although expressions such as these are bound to raise the hackles of many numismatists, who generally prefer to see coin-shaped things from the ancient world serving primarily economic functions, both Briand and Numchuk cited numerous ancient sources that highlight the role that derricks, usually in prodigious amounts, played as gifts from the great king to his worthy subjects. In Book 7 of Herodotus, for example, we hear of Pythias, grandson of Croesus, who offered to the Persian king Xerxes his stunning fortune of over 3.9 million derricks to help cover the expenses of invading Greece. The king turns down the offer and instead gives the 7,000 derricks Pythias needs to bring his fortune up to an even 4 million. Besides raising questions of where and how Pythias managed to assemble such a phenomenal mass of derricks, nearly 1,300 talents worth, the episode underscores a role for derricks as gift rather than as payment around the time these coins first appeared. Among several other such episodes, for example, we hear from Herodotus how Xerxes gave Megabyzus II, after he put down the Babylonian rebellion, quote, many presents, notably a heap of gold amounting to 6 talents. This was the most honorable present among all the royal gifts, unquote. Plutarch also notes how during every stay at Persepolis, the great king had to give a gold piece to the women of Persia in memory of the role they played during the first confrontation with the Medes. We might presume that all these gifts were derricks, especially since Diodorus writes that 9,000 talents of derricks were found by Alexander in the treasury of Susa, which suggests that derricks were not just stored in abundance east of the Euphrates, but also given out as gifts there as well. We should also note, too, that the Persian kings were not the only ones engaged in this practice of dispersing the most valuable coins produced in their realms as gifts. The last of the Lydian kings, Croesus, gave to each citizen of Delphi 2 gold staters as part of his larger donations to the sanctuary there. So Herodotus tells us. Additional numismatic gifts of this sort are not recorded for the Lydian kings, but it is not hard to imagine that they too were often generous with coins and other gifts, even closer to home. But for the Persians, this sort of gift giving was a deliberate and calculated political act, intended, among other things, to generate loyalty to the sovereign and to help ensure his political survival. In his Cyropaedia, Xenophon suggests that this practice began in the earliest days of the Achaemenid Empire. Quote, though he far exceeded all other men in the amount of the revenues he received, he excelled still more in the quality of the presents he made. It was Cyrus, therefore, who began the practice of polydeuria, lavish gift-giving, and among the kings it continues even to this day, unquote. Xenophon goes on to record a purported conversation in which Cyrus says to Croesus, I, quote, satisfy the wants of my friends, and by enriching men and doing them kindness, I win their friendship and loyalty. And from that I reap as my reward security and good fame, unquote. Briand sums up the great king's practice thusly, quote, the principle was simple. By giving awards and honors, the king intended to sustain the unfailing devotion of the men who served him. The political effect of the royal polydeuria was to constrain the behavior of the aristocrats so that they would act only in the king's interest, unquote. Now, Briand's analysis of this gift-giving corresponds almost exactly to the spirit of the formal analysis of this behavior of rulers and politicians by the political scientists Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith in their 2000 study, The Logic of Political Survival, and their more recent Dictator's Handbook, a rather timely volume for this time, I'd say. Their starting point is rational choice and the assumption that political leaders are self-interested and that their actions are chosen to be politically beneficial to themselves. Seemingly bad economic policies, such as gift giving, are not, in their view, obviously irrational. Rather, they are a phenomenon to be explained by a rational decision-making process. Much of the activity of these self-interested rulers is then oriented towards providing their essential supporters with benefits to ensure their continued support, and thus the ruler's political survival. In other words, Darius created the derricks to be an insurance policy. I'd like to conclude by proposing a revised political economy of coin production framework, one that can more readily accommodate rational decisions that veer more sharply towards the political than economic, as is arguably the case for the derricks. The motor that drives all decisions within this framework is rational choice, or the logic of maximizing advantage or utility. The goals or reasons towards which these decisions are aimed vary according to the circumstances, but are found along a spectrum ranging from those that are more purely economic to those that are more purely political, with various shades of both in between. How coins were released by the producers vary according to these goals, but could have included sale, payment, or gift giving. This framework necessarily encourages us to rethink the rationalities that lay behind a series of coins, whether in fact they were purely economic or whether they were equally, if not more so, political. And perhaps more importantly, it also encourages us to think more carefully about telling the difference between the two. Thank you.
We have mics in the room, but if you want to ask a question, I can run this mic around to you just for ideal.
I have a comment.
Sure.
There you have a mic.
And I have a mic,
yeah.
and it works. Thank you very much. That's really fascinating. And in terms of giving coins as gifts, of course, the Shahs of Persia and then Iran would give out gifts and of coins every Nowruz. And I happen to have been living in Iran just before the end of the Pahlavi regime, and for the there's the Nowruz Salam, where everybody would go up to Tehran at the palace, and the Shah would give everyone a gold coin. And that year, the Shah Banu, the Shah's wife, had a special coin minted with her face, her head on it. It was gold, a neem Pahlavi, a half Pahlavi. And because I was involved with an institute, which she was a sponsor, I was invited up to the palace. And so she had her own gift-giving ceremony in which she appeared, and all of us were assembled in a circle, and she walked around and gave each of us a pouch that contained a gold neem Pahlavi with her image on it. And that was to be the start, I imagine, of a tradition, but it was the last year of their reign.
Yeah, that's interesting because in Turkey to this day, the Turkish state continues to mint gold coins that serve the sole gift-giving purpose. These are coins that you can go and buy at a jewelers, for example, to give at weddings or other events, life events. And that really is the sole function of that, other than, say, a store of wealth, because those who receive those coins typically will then keep them for their wealth until they need to sell them or what have you. But that is an example of a current coinage that is produced solely for gift giving, basically.
Right, and I think this was. I mean, I probably could have converted gold into coinage around the world.
Right.
It was the gift and keepsake.
Yeah.
There's a question from the virtual audience. If
Sure.
you can.
Hi, Dr. Van Alfen. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have two questions, but I'll be quick. One is about, regardless of the intention of minting coins, where would these end up? I want to bring an example from Aristotle Economica with Timothy of Athens, who paid coins in bronze to his soldiers, and they were very angry. But then he said that, well, I already told the merchants that they should accept this.
Right.
So it seems that whatever initial reason was for, in this case, military payment that those coins came about, they had to end up somewhere. I just thought it's more of a comment maybe, but I thought maybe you could expand on this. And the second more specific question is about, you said that initially, you are doubtful that the Achaemenids paid the mercenaries in any form of coinage. Why are you doubtful of that? If you could also discuss that. Thank you.
All right. So the first example that you gave of Timotheus producing a special coinage to distribute to his soldiers in order to use them in a local market for provisioning, this essentially was a token coinage that was necessitated by the fact that he wasn't really feeding his troops himself, that they were requiring to go into the local market to buy their provisions there, and he didn't have silver coinage to give to his troops to do this, the silver coinage that the merchants expected. And so he created a bronze, effectively token coinage, and made an arrangement with the merchants to accept that on the provision that he would eventually repay the merchants in silver through some sort of exchange with the coins that they, the bronze coins that they would present on some sort of convertibility. So this was essentially just a very localized, effectively private network that was set up for a very specific situation. Which is quite a bit different from, say, the gift giving or other type networks, that I was discussing a little bit earlier. Now, in the second case, in terms of the mercenary issue, I'm a little hesitant about the Persians paying mercenaries at this point, just because I'm not sure about just how much evidence we have for, say, Greek mercenaries in the employ of Persians at this point, at the end of the 6th century and beginning of the 5th. In fact, overall, there just isn't as much evidence. There are, of course, some snippets of, mercenaries in employ in the Near East and in other places, but within the Aegean region, I'm just not as fully convinced of that there were as many mercenaries and that the Persians were producing these coins specifically to pay mercenaries in their employ at this period. So it really just comes down to a matter of timing and evidence and some hesitancy that I have about just how widespread mercenaries were in the Aegean at this point and whether or not the Persians would be paying them in Sigloy and Derek. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Peter, thank you for a very informative and thought-provoking talk. Mm-hmm. Assuming you're correct that we should shift the weight of explanation somewhat away from economic factors and include more weight for the political factors. Judith gave an example of a modern instance of a monarch giving items denominated as coins as gifts. But perhaps we should also think more broadly that in our modern society, which is such a commercial society where we're so familiar with coins and paper money and so accustomed to thinking of things denominated as coins or resembling coins as being primarily means of exchange or means of storing value, that we shouldn't necessarily apply that retroactively to ancient times. And Judith gave the example of the modern instance, but another instance, Napoleon, for example, struck medals which look like coins, but they're not coins. They weren't denominated as coins, but they would be struck in gold to be given to notables, and in silver to be given to more minor notables, and in copper and bronze to be given to the masses. And clearly it was a gift that was intended to enhance his prestige and serve as a kind of propaganda and gain the loyalty of the notables and the population. Yeah. And in another example of things that are denominated as coins, but are not really meant for use as currency, there's the long tradition of the British monarchs handing out Maundy money once a year. So certainly, although it's no longer as prominent as the means of exchange, that gift-giving and prestige role of items that look like coins and may sometimes even be denominated as coins continues to this day.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think that we should be thinking about as well, too, is the fact that every coin and every denomination serves certain purposes. We do segregate our money by purpose and use. If you think, for example, of, say, going to dinner afterwards, after this talk tonight, going to, a nice restaurant, racking up a bill of a couple $100, and then dumping a bucket of pennies on the table as payments, you would be chased out of the restaurant simply because pennies are not an acceptable currency within that particular, moment, that context. Whereas if you go to the bodega to buy a pack of gum and present a $100 bill, the bodega fellow is going to look at you and shake his head and say, "Come on, really? Don't you have anything, smaller?" So, we ourselves segregate currency for specific purposes, and whether or not, the issuing government is thinking about this, when they're doing that is another matter. But at least within the use factor, we do segregate money for specific, or currency items, currency forms for specific purposes.
I'll sit up to, there's Ira Rizak, I think, is the question up here.
Yes, Peter, I enjoyed your presentation, but I have two questions for you. The first is, obviously, the invention of coinage had a back history, and you didn't touch on it, but I wondered whether there's a differential history of and fiscal exchange and impression and prestige in different cultures, which would inform in some way your understanding of why coinage arose in different places differently. And the second question that I have for you is, why is it very important to distinguish all of these things when they may all arise simultaneously?
No, that's a very good point. The backstory to this paper, really is just me pushing back against those, like Francois de Calatai and Andy Meadows and others who really push, military expenditure as a major form of, or the major reason for the production of coinage, including the very first coins. So I am very hesitant about accepting that as just the reason for the production of coinage across the board. And so, and even the very first coins, for example, Andy, in his wonderful review of the white gold volume that Uta and I edited, that looks at the very first issue of coinage, Andy argues that military expenditure was the primary reason for the initiation of coinage and, for the very first coins, which, I again, am very hesitant to accept that as the reason, simply because there is a barrier of acceptance for coins. Any new monetary instrument that is introduced with a new type of coinage, new type of anything, you have to get people to accept it, and if you as a mercenary, for example, are being paid in electrum coinage, how are you going to get the guy, the next guy down the line to accept it, and so forth and so forth? So, and especially with electrum coinage that was very high valued, I think that there would be a very high barrier to acceptance. So there's, to my mind, something else going on with the initiation of this coinage, particularly within a context that might have already been using cut silver or hot silver as a monetary instrument, which would be much more suitable for daily transactions in marketplaces and so forth. So there are, those sort of issues. But in terms of a context in which gift giving of items might already have been going on, there is something of a parallel instance of the Persian kings seeming to use precious metal bowls, these absolutely lovely Achaemenid bowls, which those that have been studied seem to have been made to specific weights that correspond very precisely to the weights of sigloi or derricks or what have you. And so these bowls, which I'm forgetting who has studied these, but I do recall reading arguments that these were effectively gifts, again, from the king to certain loyal subjects that, again, seem to have had some correspondence to monetary value, or at least monetary weight standards. So, there are other contexts in which this sort of thing seems to have been going on that may or may not be parallel to the instance with the coinage. I hope that somewhat answers your questions. I'm not sure.
Let me sharpen one question.
Right.
If I were a pharaoh in the pre-coinage age, what would I use to pay my soldiers? And if I were Hammurabi, what would I use to pay my soldiers? And would there be a difference between those two cultures?
Well, it comes down to what your soldiers are expecting. If your soldiers are expecting to be fed, and you're paying them, out of some wagon that you as the military leader or pharaoh owns, then your soldiers aren't having to go into the market to buy their provisions. I mean, the difference between, say, that scenario and Timotheus is that Timotheus, his soldiers expected to be given some sort of money that they could then use in the local marketplace to buy their own food. So there could be a difference there. But your soldiers, say the pharaoh, might also be expecting to be paid simply in a plot of land at the end of service that they, could then claim as their own to hand down to their children and so forth. So it really depends on how society and these militaries are set up and structured, and what the expectations of the soldiers would be, vis-a-vis the rulers. So at that point in, I guess it would be the 26th dynasty or thereabouts, coinage was starting to be used, and precious metal already had been used since much earlier dynasties. And I don't know enough, frankly, about Egyptian military practice to say what mercenaries in Egypt would be expecting, but it could have been either payment in land or payment in precious metals of some sort, not necessarily coinage.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see that there's a question on the screen here. So Virgil has a question. If coins are gifts, they must also have some other values, such as economics. Seems a circular thing going on here. I guess my point is that these particular coins have multiple purposes. I would probably contrast this to modern military challenge coins, which cannot be used in commerce, perhaps also older metals, which would be non-economic. Well, I would say that my what I'm trying to focus on here are the rationalities behind those producing the coins. So those decisions made by either the great king or some mid-level administrators who are making the actual decisions to produce the kings, and the rationality behind that initial decision. So if, for example, the great king is his rationality for producing the derricks is to produce a gift object, which then can be given to his loyal subjects on one occasion or another. What those loyal subjects then do with that subsequently could, in fact, be economic. They could then take those to markets and use them as coins because they are obviously recognizable as coinage, and we certainly know from other sources that derricks were used as stores of value and presumably as payments. So, the subsequent use of the coin obviously could then differ from the initial gift or payment use of that coin. And, my focus here is more on that initial conception and rationality behind the production of the coin and not necessarily its subsequent use.
Daniel Wolf on the screen.
Hello.
Daniel? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Peter. This is all very fascinating stuff. This is a really lovely presentation. I appreciate what you've done.
Thank you.
I'm curious whether what we appear to see is a single size derrick and a single size siglos. Does that fact of their atomic denominations or unitary denominations bear on the consideration or how you might interpret the motivation for why they were produced? Because one might imagine if they were intended for market applications, market uses, that we would see series of denominations, lots of fractional denominations, which we do see as some coins, but to best of my understanding, not so much with these.
There are actually fractions of sigloi, and I think there might be a half derrick, if I remember correctly, but these fractions of the sigloi and derricks are incredibly rare, which would suggest that the conception and production of this coinage focus basically on the two larger denomination, the derrick of roughly 8.4 grams and the siglos eventually of 5.6 grams roughly. So again, I mean you're absolutely right that the conception behind this coinage, if for example the sigloi were intended for a range of transactions within markets, you would expect to see a fuller range of denominations, but the fact that they really are only, it seems, primarily produced in a single denomination each, would again narrow the range of usability or functionality of this coinage, which again suggests that the conception behind this, that the producer's conception would be a little bit more narrowly focused than what we'd see in a fuller denomination coinage.
Has that played a role in your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, for the derricks, certainly. I do think that the sigloi were used probably much more extensively in markets than the derricks would be, simply because the derricks were worth 20 times. A single derrick was worth 20 times the value of a single siglos, which means that the derrick would be a very, very high value coin. And, say a month's payment, the quotation from Xenophon, he said that a month's salary for a soldier would be a derrick, which means that, if you're going to take this, effectively say a $500 bill or something to the market, you're going to have to find change for it to be able to use it. The derrick itself, is around 5 grams. I mean, that's roughly equivalent to, a day's wage, maybe a little bit more. So, that could potentially be much more usable or functional on a daily transactional basis. Although obviously buying a pack of gum or a loaf of bread or something with it would be, would require some change, presumably.
Thank you very much for going over those points.
Sure. Oh, it looks like Mike Markovitz has found an Achaemenid gold bowl from the Met Museum here to share with us.
Well, do want to make a comment also. So
I was thinking of parallels from sort of the time period I study, the Roman period, where we have late Roman emperors giving out gifts also of these silver bowls full of silver coins. And there are some cases where we actually have those bowls of coins deposited intact with the coins in them. So there's this suggestion that people are actually not treating these coins as money either, even after they're being given. So of course they could, and if they needed them, they would, but that somehow these are even as they're given, are still sort of a gift object rather than being an economic object. And I'm assuming we don't really have similar sort of archaeological finds that can be where we can identify them as such from the time period you're talking about. But I was curious if there is anything.
Well, it always is very, very difficult to understand why and how a hoard, for example, came to be. So if we find a hoard of derricks, what does that mean? You know, I mean, is this somebody's life savings? Is this a hoard, you know, merchants' hoards, or, you know, what is it? Piecing together the rationality from hoards and the way they come to be is just incredibly difficult. But you know, your comment actually reminded me that, you know, the Romans did produce these medallions, you know, so-called medallions, which seem to have been, you know, primarily a gift type object. I mean, they again had some sort of monetary value and were produced according to monetary standards, but you know, the function or you know, why these were produced and how these were distributed, you know, seemed to be quite different from, say, run-of-the-mill Ari and denarii and so forth. So, you know, there, even within a Roman context, there do seem to be examples of a specific form of a coin-like thing that, you know, is not necessarily serving, you know, a more traditional economic function, but something that is something else. Yeah.
There's another question here on the screen. I can read it out if you can.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's, is there any evidence for, such as coin hoards that help suggest rationale for coinage production in Eastern Achaemenid satrapies, such as Gandhara?
I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of coin production east. Well, in fact, the usual argument is that all the derricks and sigloi were produced in Sardis, you know, which already had been a coin producing center under the Lydians, and the Persians, once they took over Sardis, continued to produce cresids down to roughly 515 when Darius came on the scene, and he then restructured everything economically and introduced the sigloi and the derricks. And that coin production, at least imperial coin production, continues in Western Asia Minor, and really, aside, say, from gift giving, as you know, suggested here, there wasn't really much coin production or coin use in the Persian heartland or farther east. So, and certainly coin production really didn't start in those more eastern areas until after Alexander the Great, for the most part. So, in this case, there wouldn't be much going on there. I see, Alireza, you have another question?
If you have time.
Sure.
You just talked about a derrick, which has so much value, it could not be used in a marketplace, especially when there is no change for it. But that would assume that there are strong infrastructures which enforce counting coins, whereas hack silver would still be common. So in that case, it would be taken and be cut into tiny pieces. I just thought to drop this point.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you had a derrick, you could take it down and buy whatever you're going to buy, and then maybe get a bag full of hawk silver as change. But that would be a half-day transaction as you're sitting counting out and weighing every little piece of hawk silver to make sure you're getting exactly your right amount of hawk silver and change for that.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yep.
Peter, I think you spoke primarily about three possible motives for issuing coins: for paying soldiers' wages or other government obligations, or as something to be used as a means of exchange in the marketplace, or as a prestige object to enhance the political power of the issuer. I wonder if you have any comments. Is there any evidence in the ancient material you're studying of a possible fourth motive, which would have been to create a useful unit for the revenue system for collecting taxes? Because, I think of pre-revolutionary France, where most of the money supply consisted of letters of credit that were used by people of means. And there was also, for manual laborers, a lot of just rather rubbishy copper that was used for paying their daily wages.
Right.
But to pay your taxes, you had to use the official coinage of the king.
Yeah. That obviously presupposes a rather well-developed and well-organized taxation system and some sort of national fisc already set up and operating. And the thing is, within the archaic Greek worlds, right around the time that coinage was first being developed, it doesn't seem that there was much state infrastructure for that sort of taxation. There were taxes that were charged for, say, imports and exports, which remained one of the primary ways that city-states would generate revenue, through import and export taxes, but not necessarily, say, on a income tax or a sales tax or things of that sort, which would require that the citizens themselves have some sort of instrument to pay the state back to, or pay back to the state. And the state infrastructure through, say the end of the archaic period anyways, doesn't seem to be, in many places, I'd say outside of Athens, might not have been as fully developed in that sense as it was towards the end of the 5th century and certainly into the 4th century. So, at the earlier period, that I'm looking at here, it is questionable, again, whether or not there was enough established taxation infrastructure to really necessitate coinage of one sort or another to facilitate that sort of tax transaction. Maybe later on, certainly, but, not towards the end of the 6th century, I'd say.
Thank you, Peter. I was just thinking, where does religion or religious purposes fall within this? I mean, for instance, there are certain things that are made just for temple donations and things like that. So where would you put that?
That's a very good question, and that's one that I try to avoid as much as possible, like the plague. I mean, there have been a number of theories that have been proposed over the years that tie religion of one sort or another to not only the introduction of coinage, but also to the production of certain series of coins, and particularly for temple donations. And we certainly know that some of the very earliest coins that we have came from excavations at Sardis, with the large temple there, where coin donations were found in some of the very earliest levels. So almost from the beginning, people were donating coins or using coins within this sort of religious context, which of course raises the question of whether or not perhaps coins, even some of these early electrum coins, were being produced specifically for that purpose. And it is conceivable. It is certainly possible. And there certainly were other coinages produced later on, such as those produced by Elis in the Western Peloponnese that were used within the context of the Olympic festival every 4 years, and certain series of coinages that were produced specifically for this Olympiad or that Olympiad or what have you, that were meant specifically to circulate within that festival religious context. And so there is a tie. I mean, there's no question that there is a tie between coinage, coin production, and religion generally, but it's one that makes me nervous, and I don't, necessarily want to go there. So,
There's another question here in the chat.
I think
referring to the Satmat.
Oh yeah, no,
coinage.
I'm afraid I'm not really familiar with that coinage, so I can't really answer the question. I'm sorry. Any other questions? All right. Well, Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching the American Numismatic Society's YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like our online resources, publication, and events, you can support the Society by becoming a member. And don't forget to check out our book and eBay stores. The links are below.